Hi guys, welcome back to Elephants in the Room. Hello. I'm still sick. This episode is going to be really far out from like the last episode where I was talking about how I was sick, because I'm batch filming a lot of these episodes because I'm going to be in Europe for a month. But I'm still sick. I've been sick for over a week now, and it's not been fun. I'm like fine. I feel fine, but I still have a lot of just congestion in my sinuses. So if my voice sounds weird, that is why. But yes, it is a good day to be alive, and I'm happy that I'm getting better slowly. It's just been, it's been a little frustrating to feel like I'm not fully better. And every time I'm sick, I always am like, holy crap, like I take for granted when I'm not sick. So we're just going to plow through today's episode with my strange voice, the way that it sounds. Also, for anyone who's watching, look how cute my nails are. I got holiday nails, the Valentine's Day nails. It has a little heart. I'm a very neutral person. You guys know that. I like neutral colors. I usually don't go too far out of my comfort zone with this stuff, but I thought I had to do something fun and special for Valentine's Day. Also, I feel very short of breath, I think because of my sinuses, so bear with me as I talk. But yeah, I'll stop yapping and I'll get into today's episode. Today, I wanted to talk about something that I've mentioned in many of my podcasts, but I don't feel like I've ever really gone in depth with. Now, again, I always say this to you guys, but I just want you guys to see and hear me when I say this. I'm not an expert. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a therapist. I am not an expert in any of these fields. I'm simply just a girl who's had a very traumatic life, who has learned a lot from it, and who wants to be a place and a space where you guys can feel seen, heard, validated, and also it can maybe give you guys inspiration to start to grow, to start to heal, and really just helping you guys maybe make sense a little bit of what's happening in your lives. So without further ado, today's episode is called Your Unhealed Trauma Affects Every Part of Your Life. This is a hot take. It's funny because I feel like, you know, the word trauma gets thrown around a lot, and it's become a very popular thing to talk about. But I feel like there's two sides of the spectrum. I feel like there's people who like totally dismiss it and think that it's stupid and think that it doesn't hold any value and that it's just an excuse. And then I feel like there's people who've actually lived through it and live in it that know it's a real thing. So I am like the friend. It's so funny. I'm always the friend who like is very open about her trauma. I'm like an open book. You guys know that. And I feel like when you go through your healing journey, whether that's starting therapy or whatever that looks like for you. For me, it was leaving the LDS church, giving my heart to Jesus, and then also starting therapy. I feel like I started my healing journey. And I feel like before you heal from or start healing from everything you've been through, you're very silent, you're very quiet. You don't talk about your trauma or what you've been through because you don't actually even validate yourself enough or what you've been through to call it trauma. And you don't want to excuse any behavior or things in your life based on what you've been through because you feel like what you've been through is normal. And so I have always been the one who's been very outspoken about my trauma. Now, since my healing journey, might I add, before that, I never talked about what I went through. Like, I was so scared to talk about what I went through. I was so ashamed and embarrassed, and I never wanted to talk about it. And now I talk about it all the time, but I feel like it's very, very, very important because I feel like it creates freedom, that vulnerability, and it creates a space where other people can feel like they can also do the same thing and start to heal and change and grow. And the start of, I feel like the healing process is just the acceptance of what's happened. Not that it's an excuse. With all that being said, I feel like I've run into so many people in my life that when I met them, they were like, yeah, like I don't have trauma. Like I had a really normal upbringing. Like nothing bad happened to me. Like I have really normal parents, and come to find out after having a relationship with them for longer that they do actually have trauma. And I think that it's so easy to, compare our traumas to one another. So for example, you may hear my story about growing up with addict parents and growing up in an LDS church and then getting married and divorced. And you're like, oh yeah, like she for sure has trauma. Like that makes sense, right? And then you look at your maybe more normal life where you have two married parents who are both, working, and you had a semi-normal life. You went to school, you had friends, you had food on the table, right? All these different things. And so you think, oh, well, I don't have any trauma. I don't have anything that has affected me. When in reality, maybe your parents were emotionally neglectful or emotionally abusive or emotionally manipulative or whatever it may be. Like, there's so many layers and ways that we can experience a level of childhood trauma. And I feel like it is common, not because our parents suck, but because we all typically repeat the cycle that we've seen in our lives. So our parents, their parents probably had certain things that they dealt with their parents, and they never really learned about them. And so they kind of just carried over some of those unhealthy habits or, unhealthy dynamics into their own lives which then bleed onto you. So it's not to say that we need to hate our parents or hate the people who've inflicted pain upon us, because a lot of times it's subconscious. It's not something that we realize. It's not something that we even identify. And so I think that's why it's really hard when you start to understand and see that, okay, wait, maybe what I have been through in my life has affected me in a negative way. It doesn't have to mean, oh, my parents are bad parents or bad people, right? It's like taking the blame off of them and understanding that it's so complex, and oftentimes the way that they are and the way that they treat you is a reflection of how they were treated. And again, that doesn't minimize or take away from the pain that you felt or the ways that it affects you. But I think it's really important to remember that if you feel like you can't validate your own trauma because you don't want to place the blame on your parents, you don't necessarily have to. Like, it doesn't need to be anyone's fault. But what's beautiful about it is you can wake up and realize, I want more for my life. I don't want to repeat these cycles. I don't want to repeat these unhealthy dynamics. And I'm going to break these chains of this generational trauma and unhealthiness that's been happening in my bloodline for however long. It doesn't have to mean you have to be mad at anyone. You can have grace and compassion, understanding that they maybe didn't know better. They maybe never took the steps to heal. And so it doesn't have to be this big negative thing. It can just be knowing that you want more for your life and knowing that what you've been through affected you. And you can be angry and you can be sad and you can be upset without having to hate someone else or without having to say the other person's bad. Now, again, in some cases, it's more extreme, and you have every right to feel any type of emotion that you want to or need to start to heal. And maybe your parents totally willingly traumatized you and you've tried to ask them to change and all these different things. Every situation is so unique, but I think the beginning of really starting to understand the way that your trauma affects your life is accepting that you might have trauma, and that's okay. It doesn't minimize or take away the good things, but it also doesn't minimize or take away the bad things and the ways that you were affected. As children, we have so many needs emotionally and physically, and no one's perfect. So it's very, very rare to have a perfect upbringing because no parents are perfect. And just because you had a quote unquote good family doesn't mean that there's things that happen in your childhood that don't affect you. There are most likely things. So that was a lot. I just went on a whole spiel, but now that was a lot, but let's get into this. And maybe you don't know if you have trauma or things that affect you, but hopefully this episode sheds a little bit of light, because I feel like that's the theme and something I'm so passionate about is that oftentimes I meet people who don't believe that they have trauma or that they've been affected by anything. And they actually totally are acting out in certain ways and they don't understand why. And I feel like there is a root, and a lot of that a lot of the time that root is this unresolved trauma from our childhood or from a relationship or whatever it is. So let's talk about it all. What if the way you react in relationships, the anxiety you can't shake, or even the chronic pain in your body is connected to something deeper, something from your childhood? I know you guys know this, but I didn't think that anything I did in my life was a result of my trauma. And when I started going to therapy, I started to identify all of the ways that I was, so many of the ways that I was rooted in my trauma. The type of partners that I attracted and or chose, my anxiety, my lack of self-trust and self-identity, my codependency and people-pleasing tendencies, like all of these things that I just thought were the way that I was. It was just how I was, my personality. They were actually rooted in trauma. It wasn't my personality. And I think oftentimes we just think, well, we just are the way that we are because we just are that way. And I'm not saying that some mental illness and or conditions aren't rooted, or like are not, genetic. I'm not saying that. It's very complex and I don't know the intricacies, but oftentimes a lot of our mental health struggles are rooted in our trauma and are rooted in the environment that we grew up in. So I didn't understand that. And then when I went to therapy and I started to debunk all of these personality traits I thought were just who I was like, holy smokes. And I also was like, why am I in this situation? I'm getting divorced. All these things are happening to me and it hurts so bad. And I didn't understand that I was not I didn't have a healthy approach to who I chose, the types of partners that I chose and the types of partners I attracted because I was repeating the cycle that was before me in my life. And I didn't understand that until I started going to therapy and really started learning that all the things that I went through in my childhood actually deeply affected me in my adulthood, like deeply, deeply. So, you may wonder, why do I keep dating the same toxic type? Like, do you find yourself always attracted to and or dating these emotionally unavailable men or women? Do you find yourself dating these narcissistic men or women? Do you find yourself dating these people who are emotionally, physically, or mentally abusive to you? You may just think, oh, I'm just this way. I just choose these type of people. No, there's a reason. There's a root. And oftentimes it's our trauma. So this is why this topic matters. Trauma is not just what happens to us, but how our brain and body store it. It's very cliche, and I used to say this too, but people will always say like, oh, well, if I just ignore my trauma or what I've been through, then I'm fine. It has no weight. It has no power over me. I'm not going to give in to it. I'm not going to give in to letting it ruin me or affect my life when they don't even realize subconsciously it is affecting you. You can try to plow through it in your mind and pretend like what you've been through doesn't affect you, but I'm here to tell you that it does. And just ignoring it and stuffing it away isn't doing you any favors in this life. Like truly, truly. And I know that sucks to hear because it's like you don't want to give too much power to what you've been through or the bad things because you're bigger than that. And it's like, yeah, you are, but there is a proper process in everything in this life to actually be able to overcome and heal from certain things. And if you think that you don't need to heal from what you've been through, you're wrong. Like it's going to affect you, not just because of what happens to you, but how your brain and body store. And this is backed by psychology, science, all these different things. I have all these statistics I'm pulling up because this stuff is real. People pretend like this isn't real. It's real stuff. And I feel like until you actually start to go through it and you start to go to therapy and like wake up, you don't think that these things are real. You don't think that they hold any value. You don't think that your trauma affects you. And I'm here to tell you, it absolutely does. And that doesn't make you a weak person. It's just the way that our bodies are built. our bodies have a self-protection. Our bodies have all these different things. We were created by God. And it's just the way that psychology works. So we're going to talk about it. So research shows trauma affects brain structure, nervous system function, and long-term health. So let's talk about the definition of trauma. So Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, he's the one who made The Body Keeps Score. And he says that trauma is an event or repeated experiences that overwhelm the nervous system, altering brain chemistry and perception of the world. So I feel like there's so many misconceptions about trauma. Like, people attach such a negative connotation to trauma, but when you really look at it in its simplest form, trauma is just an event that overwhelms our nervous system, that stresses our bodies out, and especially from a young age, they can alter our brain chemistry and perception of the world. So let's talk about the different types of trauma. There's acute trauma, so a one-time distressing event, accident, and or assault. There's chronic trauma, and that is ongoing stress. So an example would be abuse, neglect, witnessing violence. And then there's complex trauma, exposure to multiple traumas over time, often involving your caregivers. Now, I've talked about this before, but I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the ACEs test. I encourage you guys to go and take it. It's called ACEs, and it's Adverse Childhood Experiences. And it's pretty much a 10 question test, and you go through and you click yes or no to each one, and they're all kind of describing different traumatic events, especially as a child. And at the end of the test, you have a score of 1 to 10. And based on your score, that kind of dictates what all the statistics say about childhood trauma. So they say that if you score a 4 or above, you have severe childhood trauma, and that there's actually effects to that. Like, there's studies that show that there's effects. So this experiment/study that Dr. Kaiser did in 1998, he examined 17,000 plus individuals, found that childhood trauma correlates with lifelong health issues, mental illness, and even premature death. A higher ACE score means higher risk of depression, substance abuse, heart disease, and autoimmune disorders, and even cancer. So the proof is in the pudding, people. Like, childhood trauma affects you, especially when it goes unhealed. Especially. So let's talk about the science behind trauma in the brain. So trauma actually changes the brain. So there's this thing in your brain called the amygdala, which is your fear center. And that's typically very overactive in trauma survivor, leading to hypervigilance and anxiety. So I wanted to talk about hypervigilance because when I was researching about this, I found this word and I was like, okay, what does this mean? And then I read it and I was like, holy crap. So let's see here. So hypervigilance is a state of heightened alertness and watchfulness where someone is constantly on guard for potential danger. So that's something I definitely relate to in being a trauma survivor, is that I've always been, I feel like, hypervigilant. Like, I'm always like, feel like this heightened alertness to like fear and danger. And, it's really overwhelming. The next part of the brain that trauma affects is the hippocampus. This is crazy. When I was researching about this, I was like, this is insane. The hippocampus is the part of our brain that processes memory and stores memory. So trauma actually shrinks this region, causing memory issues, emotional dysregulation, and difficulty distinguishing past from present danger. If you have trauma, you get quote unquote triggered, and it is really hard for your body to identify the difference between what is actually happening right in front of you and what's happened to you in the past. For example, I have abandonment issues. So when I ever felt like I was being abandoned or something was happening, even if I wasn't actually being abandoned, oftentimes it was rooted in what I had experienced in my childhood and me expecting that to happen again. It was like I was triggered and that deep abandonment wound would get triggered. And until I started to actually heal from that, it was really, really intense, extremely, extremely intense. The next part of your brain that trauma affects is your prefrontal cortex, logic and decision making. Trauma reduces function here, making it harder to regulate emotions and impulses. I've always had such a hard time making decisions, and I've always had such a lack of self-trust, and that's something that I've slowly started to heal from. But I remember being so frustrated when I was trying to decide if I was going to move from Arizona to LA. And I remember talking to my therapist, and the decision when I was trying to make it was so overwhelming for me, and I didn't understand why. And I remember talking to her and being like, I'm just questioning myself. I'm questioning the decision that I feel like I want to make. I feel like it's the right thing, but I'm just questioning it, and I just don't know what to do. And why don't I trust myself? What's wrong with me? And I remember her being like, Nicole, one of the biggest side effects of severe trauma is that you have a hard time not only making decisions, but trusting yourself. And we're going to talk about the reasons for that. But that is something that I definitely went through and still at times feel like I'm healing from. The next thing is, we've talked about this, but there are many trauma responses, obviously. And when our body senses danger, it goes into fight or flight. And there are 4 different ways that our body reacts in fight or flight and or survival mode. It's fight, so anger, aggression, controlling behaviors; flight, overworking, perfectionism, avoiding conflict; freeze, disassociation, numbness, feeling stuck; and fawn, people-pleasing, neglecting personal needs for approval. Now, there's also this study example about PTSD in the nervous system. Harvard research found that chronic stress and trauma cause the nervous system to stay in a constant state of hyperarousal or shutdown, leading to anxiety, depression, and chronic illness. So this is all obviously very intense, but let's talk about some of the signs that you may have some unhealed trauma, because you may be listening to this and you're like, well, I don't think I have trauma. I think I'm fine. I think I'm good. And you may be watching this and being like, yeah, I think I might have some unresolved trauma that I need to heal from. And so let's talk about some of the signs that you may have some unhealed trauma. Trauma, particularly from childhood, disrupts the development of self-trust in several ways. So, like I said, one of the biggest things I struggled with in my early adult years before I started healing from all of my trauma was this lack of self-trust. Just this deep lack of self-trust, which sent me into so much anxiety and catastrophizing. So this is why trauma survivors struggle with self-trust. So if you feel like you might have self-trust issues, listen to this. It creates a disrupted attachment. If caregivers were inconsistent, neglectful, or abusive, the child learns that the world is unpredictable and that they cannot rely on others or themselves. That's crazy. I just want you to think about that for a second. So as a child, we have all of these needs, right? And our parents are supposed to be the ones that are supposed to protect us, to take care of us, to nurture us, to fulfill our emotional needs, our physical needs. And it's crazy because a disrupted attachment is rooted in your parents or caregivers being inconsistent, neglectful, or abusive. So it makes the child learn that the world is unpredictable and that they cannot rely on others or themselves. So if you feel like that, I want you to just think about that for a second, because that was me. I lived in a state of inconsistency with my parents because they were both addicts, and a back and forth of nurturing and neglectfulness because I wasn't always taken care of the way that I should have been. And I 100% always had such an anxiety about relying on others, but even on myself. I felt like I couldn't rely on anyone. I couldn't trust myself and I couldn't trust others. And that's a terrible feeling to have. And if you have that feeling, you deserve to heal from that. The next reason that trauma survivors struggle with self-trust is that there is a hypervigilance and self-doubt. Hypervigilance is a state of heightened awareness and a constant scanning of the environment for potential threats, often seen in trauma survivors. This can make them second guess their own judgments and instincts. There's nothing worse than feeling like you constantly have to walk on eggshells and you're constantly analyzing other people's behaviors and other people's feelings. You're so overly aware of everyone else and everything else because deep down you're scared. You're looking for danger because that's what you know. That's what you've seen. So you are so hyper aware of other people's emotions and the way that they act. And you suppress and neglect the way that you feel because you're so worried about the other person and how they feel. And watching their every move and monitoring their every feeling and trying to keep the peace. And that is rooted in trauma, people. I want you to hear me when I say that. I believe. I'm no expert, but I believe that it is because I've experienced that. Another reason that trauma survivors struggle with self-trust is gaslighting and invalidated emotions. If someone grows up having their feelings dismissed, for an example, your parents may say you're overreacting or that didn't happen, they may struggle to trust their own perceptions as adults. This is crazy because I've firsthand seen this in my life with someone that I really care about, and their parents 100% invalidated their emotions, and it has made them struggle their own perception. Like, it's crazy because we put so much, naturally the way we were created is we put so much trust into our parents and into our caregivers that if they dismiss our emotions as children or gaslight us as children, we're not even going to trust ourselves because we gaslight ourselves. Like, it's so crazy when you don't have that root of healthiness, of a healthy space where you can process your emotions and where you can feel validated and heard in your emotions. You will naturally neglect your emotions just as if it was done to you. Like, you repeat that cycle because when we're children, we're so susceptible. Like, we're learning as children. We're absorbing so much information and absorbing so much of what we go through naturally as children, especially from our parents. And the next reason trauma survivors struggle with self-trust is fear of making mistakes. Many trauma survivors develop perfectionism or decision paralysis because the fear of the consequences of being wrong. When you weren't allowed to make mistakes as a kid and you didn't feel like you could without your parents being disappointed in you, being mean to you, loving you less, when you feel like you didn't have a space to mess up and work through it and you didn't have parents that said, hey, you made this mistake, but it's okay, and this is what you learn from it, and this is how you deal with the mistake, this is how you deal with a mess, this is how you pick up the pieces, you're going to be such a perfectionist and you're going to have decision paralysis, which is literally what I had. Is like I felt paralyzed by every decision that I made in fear that I was making the wrong decision. But like, it's okay to make the wrong decision in life. Like, that's okay. It's not the end of the world. And learning how to do that from a young age is so important because it shapes our adulthood and our habits in adulthood. Restoring self-trust involves rebuilding internal safety, recognizing intuition, and practicing self-validation. Therapy, mindfulness, and inner child work can help rewire the brain's trust mechanisms. And I want to encourage you guys with that. You may be hearing all of this and you're like, holy freaking crap. I have this trauma and it's affecting me and my brain is screwed up. Your brain is not screwed up. You just need to start to get to the root of these things. And when you actually get to the root and give them the space and place to be seen and heard and validated, you will start healing and your brain will actually start rewiring and start changing for the better. you're not screwed. Okay, so let's talk about some of the signs you may have some unhealed trauma that you need to work through. Persistent anxiety or depression, explosive or numbed emotions, fear of abandonment or difficulty trusting others, self-sabotaging in relationships / career, avoidance of emotional situations or intimacy, hyper-independence or extreme dependence. Oh goodness. Let's just to, maybe help you guys feel a little bit better about your own trauma. I'm going to talk about some of the signs that I had that showed me that I had some unhealed trauma that I needed to work through. Now, obviously, I didn't know or understand those signs at the time, but now I do. And my therapist helped me to kind of see some of these things. And the good thing about this, some of the things that I struggled with for sure was I had a lot of very numbed emotions, a lot of things that I suppressed for a very long time. And then when I got divorced, I felt all these intense emotions. And even though, yes, what I was going through when I got divorced was extremely traumatic, I was also feeling the pain of these deeper wounds that I never actually felt. So when I was abandoned, I was not only just feeling being abandoned in that relationship, I was feeling that deep buried wound of being abandoned as a child. So I was feeling the weight and the heaviness of a way bigger wound than I realized. And obviously, I struggled with a fear of abandonment and trusting others. And I also definitely was hyper independent. It's interesting because I feel like I flip-flop between being hyper independent and extremely dependent because I was codependent and I struggled with people pleasing. But hyper independence, I did like everything in my power to be independent and to not need anyone. I don't need anyone, like to the point where I wouldn't even ever allow myself to ask others for help, and I wouldn't even ever allow myself to be honest about if I was struggling. I was just so like, I don't need anyone, I'm independent, all these things. And I thought that was just my personality. And I was like, just this independent person, which is good to be independent. It's good to rely on yourself in your own ways. But it can easily become not a good thing when you're not willing to receive help when you need it. You're not willing to let someone else in a relationship because you've created this hyper independence. So those were some of the signs for me. Also, obviously, my lack of self-trust, my anxiety. I feel like I had a lot of chronic pain. So if you feel like you struggle with any of those things, you may have some unresolved trauma, in my opinion. So let's talk about something that's really crazy. I feel like you guys have probably heard this before, but they always say like, oh, like you repeat the same cycle from your childhood over and over again, or you attract someone like your mom, or you attract someone like your dad, right? And typically if we come from trauma, that's not a good thing, right? We feel like we repeat these cycles. Now, I want to talk about the psychology behind this because this is crazy. So there's this thing called repetition compulsion, and it is why trauma survivors keep recreating their pain. Repetition compulsion is a psychological phenomenon where individuals unconsciously repeat past traumatic experiences in an attempt to gain mastery over them. Instead of avoiding the pain, they unknowingly seek out situations that mirror their original trauma, hoping for a different outcome, but often end up reinforcing the same wounds. So here's an example. In relationships, someone abandoned by a parent might repeatedly date emotionally unavailable partners. At work, a person who was overly criticized as a child might choose jobs where they are undervalued. Self-sabotage, fear of success or happiness because it feels unfamiliar. Holy crap, this like blew my mind, and I feel like this has been talked about before, but when I was researching about it, I was like, that is crazy. So our brain literally, like when we go through a traumatic experience, we recreate the scenario or situation to try to solve it. And it's because our brains are made to problem solve. So we believe that we can correct it. Like that's oftentimes our way of like trying to subconsciously heal, is by putting ourselves in the same situation and expecting a different outcome, expecting that if we do more things right, or if we change things, that we'll be able to solve it and that will heal us. But it's so sad and it's so messed up, because oftentimes we are putting ourselves in these toxic, unhealthy, abusive relationships because that's all we know. That's the only blueprint we have in our head of what a relationship is supposed to look like. And we think that if we keep repeating the cycle, at some point we'll be able to fix it. At some point we'll be enough for that partner. If you grew up with a parent that you were never enough for, you may choose partners that you're not enough for, and you will continue to be rejected over and over and over again, thinking that at some point you'll break the cycle. Or if you grew up with someone who was, narcissistic or unhealthy, emotionally abusive, someone that dismisses your emotions, someone that gaslights you, someone that does all these things, like you will look for that in a partner subconsciously. But it's literally because your brain is unconsciously repeating these past traumatic experiences in an attempt to gain mastery over them. It's crazy. It's actually crazy. Like when I started researching about this, I was like, what? I was like, that's the craziest thing. I want to show one more thing here. You don't realize that oftentimes you're repeating the cycle, and you are. And there's so many different shows and movies that kind of show this and talk about this. Like one that I'm thinking of is called Made. And oftentimes like we come from trauma. So like in that movie, like her mom and dad, like her mom is very emotionally unstable and her dad is an alcoholic and he's abusive to her mother. And then she ends up getting pregnant with a guy who is emotionally and physically abusive to her. And it's like this cycle repeats. And it's so weird because you would think that we would not desire the same thing, but subconsciously we do recreate those patterns and or situations because it's all that our brain knows. And it's like, it's just so interesting how we attract those people. Like, I just like, it's very crazy, and it's kind of scary. It's kind of scary that we look for who has hurt us in the past and the type of situations that have hurt us in the past and the type of toxic partners who have hurt us in the past. And oftentimes you'll end up repeating that until you start healing. And I definitely didn't realize when I got married that I was repeating the cycle that I had seen my mother go through. I didn't know that. I thought that I had great discernment and that I chose the right type of person for me. Little did I know I had rose-colored glasses on, and I was literally repeating the same cycle that had happened before me. Even though so deeply I desired to not be anything like my parents, I was literally setting myself up to be back in a similar situation that I was and that my mother was. And it's crazy because my mom's mom did the same thing. Like my mom's mom ended up with a guy who cheated on her and left her. And it's just like crazy how this cycle repeats. It repeats until we start actually getting healthy and understanding that these things, you can't just think through these things. You can't just power through these things. Like there are ways that your trauma unconsciously affects you that you just don't even realize. That's the whole point that I'm trying to get at, is that until you actually start to uncover and unravel all these things that you've gone through, you don't even really know the way that they affect you. Because oftentimes we are just a byproduct of our environment and a byproduct of what we've been through, and we don't even realize it. We don't even know. And I'm not saying that everyone needs to do all this work, but I'm just saying, don't you want more? If you are repeating a cycle, if you are repeating unhealthy dynamics, unhealthy habits, if you have anxiety or chronic pain or chronic stress, or you have a lack of self-trust, or you are hyper independent, or you are attracting toxic people in your life, or you are whatever, don't you want more for your life? Don't you want to be operating not out of a place of what's happened to you? Don't you want to be operating out of a place of like who you truly are? And I feel like that's been part of my healing journey, and I'm still in the process. I'm not perfect. I'm not an expert, but it's starting to even identify, who is Nicole? Who am I? Because for so long, I wrapped my identity and my personality into all of these things that were really just a result of what had happened to me. And so it's like your whole world gets shaken up, and you start to realize that there's a root for most of what we do in this life. Yeah, and like I said, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychologist. I don't have all the answers. But I just want to bring some awareness to the fact that trauma, the saddest thing about trauma is that I feel like it's a thief. It steals our joy. It steals the ability to operate and function out of a pure place, out of a healthy place, not out of a place of pain. And it really does bleed into so many aspects of our lives, our relationships, our friendships, the type of people we choose, the type of jobs we choose, the type of mental health struggles that we go through. Like, there's so many effects to trauma and what you've been through. And until you start to accept that and start to give that deep pain within you, those deep wounds, a voice, a space, until you start to validate what you've been through, you won't actually heal. And it doesn't mean you need to stay stuck and you need to stay trapped. I think people think that if you accept that you have trauma, and if you accept that things that have happened to you affect you, that you're giving power to your trauma. No. You're actually giving power to yourself, because you're allowing yourself to actually heal from that trauma, which then will give you your power back. It will let you start to act and live out of a place of healthiness, not out of a place of pain, not out of a place of being impacted by what we went through, which then shapes the way we see the world. It's not to say that your perception of the world will change, but it's just like it opens up a whole new door to life where you're not operating out of these wounds and out of these ideas that have stemmed from this pain, that have stemmed from this stress, that have stemmed from these things that we've been through. I want to talk about some of the needs of a child. So, a safe and stable home environment helps children develop a strong sense of self-worth. Children who feel safe are more likely to be curious and explore. Feeling like an important part of your family, friend group, and/or classroom shapes a child's self-worth and happiness. It also affects how children relate to others. Making time for love and affection helps children feel secure and confident. This sense of security is called bonding or attachment. Play allows children to use their creativity to develop their imagination, and it helps their physical, cognitive, and emotional strength. It's important for a healthy brain development. And so the needs of a child: quality time, emotional support, structure. According to child psychology, a child's basic needs include physical safety and security, a sense of belonging and love, positive self-esteem, opportunities for learning and development, appropriate boundaries and discipline, and a supportive environment from caregivers. So, all of that to say, your parents aren't bad people if there was a way that you were affected as a child because of something that they did. Like, no parent is perfect, but that's the beginning of starting to heal, is understanding that there may have been something that they lacked giving you, one of your needs as a child, that affected your development as a child. And that doesn't make them bad parents, but it also doesn't take away from maybe something they did or didn't do affected you and then bled into your life. Unhealed trauma doesn't just stay in the past. It bleeds into every aspect of life. It affects relationships, decision-making, self-worth, physical health, and even faith. People often don't realize they're carrying trauma until it manifests as anxiety, control issues, trust problems, or self-sabotage. So there is just so much that goes into this. And I truly believe that God has more for us. And I truly believe that trauma is rooted in sin. And that has helped me come to terms with what I've been through in my life and the way that it affects me. Because I think oftentimes when we grow up in traumatic situations or we endure trauma within a relationship, even in our adult years or whatever it may be, and it affects us deeply, and we start to understand that it does affect us deeply and affects the way we operate, we can be really angry at God and really confused as to why he would ever allow for any of this to happen. But for God to have a truly free and loving relationship with us, he had to give us the choice. And if there's such thing as good, there is such thing as evil. If there is such thing as good, there has to be an opposite. And I believe that so much trauma is rooted in sin. And that's what's so sad about it, is that it's oftentimes so subconscious, and the things that our parents did are things that their parents did. But, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, all these different things, neglect, anger, yelling, gaslighting, all these different things, withholding love, neglect, abandonment, abuse, they're all rooted in sin. They're all rooted in evil. They're not rooted in good things. And so when you start to understand that that's where it all stems from, it doesn't take it away, but it can help you have acceptance for and understand that it's not like God's plan for us to just be miserable and to suffer, but inherently it will happen. We will endure the consequences of other people's actions. But with that being said, that is why I feel like our body has it's designed to protect ourselves, right? That's why there's such thing as survival mode. When we sense danger, our body goes into a state of survival. The problem is that our body can't tell the difference between emotional danger and physical danger. And so going into fight or flight, when we deal with this emotionally distressing things that, trauma, our body goes into fight or flight, and our bodies are not designed to live in fight or flight. And that's why chronic stress from trauma can lead into health issues and chronic pain and all these different things. And so all of that to say, there is healing. There is healing in all of this, but the first part of it is not ignoring and or dismissing it. It's accepting it. And it's giving it a space to hold. Because when you actually allow what has been done to you to be seen and to be validated, that's the beginning of healing. All of this can feel so overwhelming. But there is healing. There is healing within all of it. And the first step, you got to recognize it. You got to accept it. You got to accept what has happened to you and that it affects you. And when you start to do that, you may be able to start to recognize the pattern that you are recreating in your life due to what you've seen in your life and what you've been through. The next part is so, so important, and I feel like such a huge part of healing, and that's therapy. There's EMDR, there's all these different types of therapies that you can do to start to heal from childhood trauma. And like I said, I think a huge part of it is identifying that you first have it. And then, like something that I did, that really helped me start to heal from my childhood trauma, which I'm still healing from because it's a journey and a process, is my therapist had me make a trauma timeline. So she had me write down every single traumatic event that I've ever been through. And part of the way our brains deal with trauma is, like I talked about, memory loss. And so oftentimes we can kind of forget a lot of our traumas. So she made me actually write everything down, which took a long time and was really hard. But then when I was able to write it down, she had me do this practice where I would rate my anxiety before I read it, rate my anxiety after I read that bullet point or story of trauma. And then I would read a verse that correlated directly to the traumatic experience that was kind of an encouragement and or healing word from God in regards to that. Like if I felt abandoned or not chose in that specific traumatic event, I would read a verse about being chosen by God and being loved by God. And then I would pray, and then I would rate my anxiety after I did that. And typically my anxiety would always go down. So I started to actually create, it's hard to explain, but when you do that, you can actually create like a more positive reaction to that specific traumatic event because you kind of replace that emotion tied to it when you can actually uncover it. And that's the same thing, same type of concept as EMDR. So there are ways and strategies to heal from trauma, but the first is understanding and recognizing the pattern, and then it's starting to work through those things in whatever way you choose to do that. I recommend you find a therapist. I recommend you research. Knowledge is power. The more knowledge you have and the more understood you feel, the better you are going to be able to heal. And part of, that's a huge part of healing is just feeling understood and validated in whatever emotion and or thing you went through. So knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. Expression is power. So validating those emotions and also having someone else validate. Oh yeah, what you went through was hard, and that does have effects. That's a huge part. And a really, really, really big part, I feel like, of breaking the cycle and starting to heal is choosing healthy discomfort over familiar pain. You got to start changing the pattern. We feel comfortable living in what we know. And so oftentimes we repeat these cycles, these unhealthy dynamics and unhealthy cycles, and we repeat the cycle of this generational trauma because it's comfortable, because it's what we know. We like the chaos because it's comfortable. I remember when I first started getting healthy and I was in therapy and I finally felt like my body come out of fight or flight and out of survival mode, and I started to feel calm. Feeling calm and not dealing with something all the time almost stressed me out more. And I remember my therapist being like, Nicole, it's because you crave chaos. You love chaos because that's all you've ever had. That's what you know. So you have to start getting comfortable in this normalcy. I was so addicted to being in situations where I had to solve something, I had to fix something, that there was something going on. My body wanted that, my mind wanted that because I was so used to living in chaos and in emotional chaos and in emotional relationships that were really unhealthy, that when I started to get out of those things and create healthy relationships and step out of those toxic relationships, I was craving this chaos because it was comfortable. So understanding that when you start walking into healthiness and when you start setting boundaries and when you start trying to stop the cycle and change your patterns and change your habits, it's going to be uncomfortable. And that's okay. You have to be aware and you have to have self-reflection. Identify your trauma responses. Like I said, therapy, so important. And the next one is reparenting yourself. Research inner child work and start trying to practice self-compassion. That's so important, and I encourage you to go do more research about that. And a huge part, the biggest part of what helped me to start heal from my trauma was God's voice and God's word. God's word cuts like a knife. And when I actually started reading the Bible and I started reading who God is, what God says about me, the healing that God offers to those who turn to him, the profound and powerful lessons and words in the Bible, the encouragements, the answers. There's so many answers in the Bible for things that we go through on a day-to-day basis when we feel conflicted, we don't know what to do. How would God want us to deal with this? I found that really, really listening and diving deeply into his word started helping me heal. And when I started to replace the deep wounds that I had from my parents with the love and purity of God's love for me because he's my parent, I started to heal some of that lack of identity that I had, that lack of self-love, because when you see that you're loved, when you feel loved by your parents, it helps you to love others and it helps you to love yourself better. And I don't feel like I really had that because of the inconsistency with my parents and the neglect and the abandonment, that when I started to feel like God showed up for me, I started to feel like he started to parent me, and I started to let him reparent me and reteach me about who I am and how valuable I am. And that really started to help me heal. So I feel like through Jesus and his word and through therapy, which I feel like is one of the biggest blessings that God has given us. And I think a lot of Christians don't like therapy because they think, oh, well, you just need God to heal. Yeah, you also need knowledge. And therapists have knowledge. They understand the brain. They understand how psychology works, and they can help you start to undo some of what you've been through. So all of that to say, I love you guys, and I want healing for you. And I'm no expert. I'm just a girl. But I just want to encourage you that trauma isn't a life sentence. You can rewire it. You can rewire these ways that your brain has been affected. And your trauma is not your fault, but healing is your responsibility. And it's your opportunity. So I love you guys so much. Hope you guys enjoyed this week's episode. If you guys want to support me, you can share this podcast with a friend, share it on your story, leave a comment, rating, review, and hope you felt heard in this episode. And I hope that I encouraged you and that I didn't scare you. I just want healing for me. I want healing for you guys. And I want us to all be aware of these things because they're real. But I love you guys so much. I'll close this episode out by saying, what elephants are in your room? My name is Nicole, and I'll talk to you guys next week.